Extreme cut. First of all, we made a color blooper. Second of all, we made a color blooper on the TVO text. Third of all, we made a color blooper on the on word and the Nickelodeon word. Fourth of all, we made a color blooper on the productions text. Fifth of all, we made a background color blooper. Sixth of all, we made a font blooper. Seventh of all, we made a font blooper in the TVO text. Eighth of all, we made a font blooper on the on word and the Nickelodeon word. Ninth of all, we made a font blooper in the productions text. 10th of all, we made a fan-made language blooper. 11th of all, we had a different letter. 12th of all, we had a fan-made letter. 13th of all, we had a fan-made letter in the TVO text. 14th of all, we had a different symbol in the TVO text. 15th of all, we had a different uppercase letter. 16th of all, we had a different letter that's been added. 17th of all, we had a different letter that's still floating. 18th of all, we had a different letter that's overflated. 19th of all, we had a fan-made letter that's been added. 20th of all, we had a fan-made letter that's still floating. 21st of all, we had a fan-made letter that's overflated. 22nd of all, we had a TVO text letter that's been added. 23rd of all, we had a TVO text letter that's still floating. 24th of all, we had a Mr. letter that's been added. 25th of all, we had a Mr. letter that's still floating. 26th of all, we had a different number that's been added. 27th of all, we had a big number that's been added. 28th of all, we had a bigger number that's been added. 29th of all, we had a different number that's still floating. 30th of all, we had a big number that's still floating. 31st of all, we had a bigger number that's still floating. 32nd of all, we had a different number that's overflated. 33rd of all, we had a big number that's overflated. 34th of all, we had a bigger number that's overflated. 25th of all, we had a Spanish letter that's been added. 26th of all, we had a different language letter that's been added. 37th of all, we had a Greek letter that's been added. 38th of all, we had a Greek letter that's still floating. 39th of all, we had a Russian letter that's been added. 40th of all, we had a Russian letter that's still floating. 41st of all, we had a Russian letter that's overflated. 42nd of all, we had a Hebrew letter that's been added. 43rd of all, we had a Hebrew letter that's still floating. 44th of all, we had a Hebrew letter that's overflated. 45th of all, we had an Arabic letter that's been added. 46th of all, we had an Arabic letter that's still floating. 47th of all, we had a Coptic letter that's been added. 48th of all, we had a Coptic letter that's still floating. 49th of all, we had a Coptic letter that's overflated. 50th of all, we had an Armenian letter that's been added. 51st of all, we had an Armenian letter that's still floating. 52nd of all, we had an Armenian letter that's overflated. 53rd of all, we had a Georgian letter that's been added. 54th of all, we had a Georgian letter that's still floating. 55th of all, we had a Vietnamese letter that's been added. 56th of all, we had a Vietnamese letter that's still floating. 57th of all, we had a Vietnamese letter that's overflated. 58th of all, we had a Japanese letter that's been added. 59th of all, we had a Japanese letter that's still floating. 60th of all, we had a different language letter that's overflated. 61st of all, we had a fan-made Russian letter that's been added. 62nd of all, we had a fan-made Russian letter that's still floating. 63rd of all, we had a fan-made Japanese letter that's been added. 64th of all, we had a fan-made Japanese letter that's still floating. 65th of all, we had a character design that's been added. 66th of all, we had a character design that's still floating. 67th of all, Max is upside down. 68th of all, the Toys R Us ampersand is upside down. 69th of all, we made a glitchy blooper. And 70th of all, we made a crazy blooper. This time we had 70 bloopers at once!